Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Barry Merrick. I'm co-founder and CEO at Ivy and the chapter chair of YPO Metro New York. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce all of you to Jonah Sachs. Jonah, welcome. How are you today?
One second, just start my video here. I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
It's so good to have you. Welcome, and a big welcome to everyone joining us from across the world, whether live or a subsequent recording. We are thrilled to have you here. We're going to have also a thrilling conversation. We're going to be talking about winning the story wars and why those who tell the best stories will rule the future. And Jonah is the ultimate guide for us on this journey today. He is the executive director at One Project. He's a globally renowned viral marketing pioneer. And he's worked on some of the most meaningful, impactful campaigns out there. His work on Amnesty International's Blood Diamonds film was viewed by more than 20 million people around the world and delivered to every member of Congress. He created this story of stuff viewed by over 60 million people. And he's worked with incredible organizations ranging from human rights campaigns, ACLU, Greenpeace, Microsoft, Patagonia, you name it, anyone who wants to have a positive impact. He's been helping them really craft their story and evolving his journey also. He also wrote the book, Winning the Story Wars, which has been an incredible inspiration and guide to so many business leaders like myself who are looking to tell a powerful story to get people to take positive action. So Jonah, so good to have you here. To get us kicked off, I'd love to ask you, what led you those many years ago? What led you to writing this book? What was your vision for it? And now, many years later, as you look back on your work, what is kind of like the ongoing role that you think it can play for business leaders around the world?
Yeah, so I really stumbled into writing this book. I was 23 when I started my advertising agency and trying to do this social good advertising, essentially. And I had this insight at the time that as television networks were loosening their grip on people's attention and people were starting to basically email, this is 1999, starting to email things they cared most about, that messages that spoke to people's values were actually going to travel faster than ads for sneakers and hamburgers. Like, you wouldn't want to send to your friends an ad, you want to send your values. So I was trying to figure out, how do you leverage this? And I started making these really silly spoof movies for clients. So I made this one based on The Matrix called The Matrix, about factory farming. And, this is before anyone watched videos on the internet, and 40, 50 million people were watching it, getting on CNN, getting on the front page of USA Today as this new viral phenomenon. So then I was like, well, the spoof thing really works. And so I made a Star Wars spoof about grocery store wars, about organic food. And basically people started saying, well, how are you telling these stories that travel so well? And I'm like, I don't know, I'm just copying other people's stories. But I was looking for that deeper, what was I tapping into? I literally just Googled Star Wars and The Matrix because I said, these movies obviously touch something in people. And that's where I first got exposed to Joseph Campbell and The Hero's Journey. And it just said, both these movies were written on a formula of ancient myths. My brain lit up, and I was a cultural studies major in college. And so I was just like, well, what does this mean for society that we have these myths and they always work? I started researching it, and in trying to repeat those successes, because when you do viral marketing, you have to be on the edge at all times and getting people to give you permission to sort of share their networks. I realized that myth making is very much alive today. It's an amazing subject, fascinating, and went to Harvard Business Review and said, I'd like to start talking about this. And they said, storytelling is probably the next big thing. And together we put this book together. So I was as much learning as I was teaching when I wrote that book. Since then, I think it's really been such a fascinating journey to be someone who speaks about and cares about stories. Again, it started with silly spoofs when I was basically a kid. Now I see that stories just connect us to our purpose. They're like one of the most important leadership tools. And the world has really come around to just seeing how important, in a world awash with facts and data, meaningful stories really are. So I consider it a bit of a calling to share the message about how to do it and why it matters.
Beautifully said, and we're so happy to learn from you firsthand today. Before we dive deeper, you already kind of hinted at why it's so important, but let's make it super explicit, Jonah. Like, how important is storytelling really? Like, what's actually at stake here? Because some people might be thinking, oh, you gotta, make things viral and shareable, but like ultimately in this bigger context of how humanity is wired and what the role is that stories have played and will continue to play, what do you think is truly at stake here?
Yeah, so I think we can look at it at two levels. Let's look at it first on the individual level. If you guys raise kids, have a child, you know that they'll sit on your lap and ask you for story after story after story. That's kind of cute. You think they just want to be entertained. In reality, a kid is asking their parents to tell them stories because stories are reality simulators. They basically teach us so that we don't have to learn for ourselves what's dangerous, what's good, what matters, what doesn't matter, who we are, who they are. All these questions about identity and about values and about the purpose of life are transmitted from elder people to children through stories. That's how humans are wired, essentially, to learn and not have to make the same mistakes that their ancestors made. And one of the great reasons that humans have spread over the globe is not because our individual brains are so brilliant, but our collective memory is so brilliant. And those are encoded in stories. If I were to just tell you a bunch of facts, unless you're writing them down and then keeping that notebook in front of you, you're never going to remember. But if I tell you a story about someone who took a big risk in the face of impossible odds and succeeded and got the treasure and became the king, you're going to remember that value of taking big risk, of entrepreneurialism, of big rewards, and it's going to stick in your brain. So on an individual level, the way that we learn and the way that we encode memory is through stories, and we kind of forget that in a world of facts and figures, how important it is to stick in someone's mind. On the level of a society, there's the concept of myth making. And myths, we think today of as like lies, that something's a myth when it's a lie. And there's truth and there's myth. Carl Jung talked about myth in terms of the core stories that hold society together, and that the identity of a tribe and the us are people who share a creation story, share a meaning story, and the them are people with a different story. Now we live in this global society, and our core stories are kind of being broken apart. In the book, I really talk about, though, how marketers have become the new myth maker. And if you want, we can kind of go into why that is. But more and more, as our core religious stories and cultural stories have broken down, we have found that the people who have mastered the storytelling art and made us identify with products and brands are the marketers who have stepped into that space. I don't think that's positive for society necessarily. I think we need news stories, and not just on TV and on the internet through advertising. But I can tell you that those who do tell those stories succeed in marketing in ways that those who fail to, just can't.
Beautifully said, Jonah. I really appreciate that. And, it's actually rare to like zoom all the way out and really think about the role it plays. I love what you said about it's a simulator so that, you can actually learn through others' experiences, but also society needs this to also function. What are the common beliefs? So before we dive into how to win the story wars, what are the key factors that go into it? Let's actually start with, what are people screwing up most often when it comes to storytelling? What are the biggest pitfalls or the myths people believe in about storytelling that are just simply not true or ineffective? No matter how smart an executive, no matter how big an organization, where do people screw up when it comes to effective storytelling? Let's start with that. Then we'll go into what we should be doing.
This could take the rest of the whole time. Just think of a couple. So first off, when you tell a story and you make yourself the hero of the story, people basically glaze over and they don't really care. So that's one of the main problems that leaders fall into, or that brands fall into. They're going to come up there and say, here's all the great things that I've done. Here are all the great things that I can do. And that's, very typical broadcast advertising style or broadcast leadership style. And great stories grab someone and hold them when the listener can see themselves in the story. So stories that are sort of self-aggrandizing put this space between you and your listener. Of course, we all want heroes, but it's very hard to sort of believe someone that you don't have complete trust in, that they are actually the hero. So what you want to do is tell stories that are tangible and relatable enough that someone says, oh, I can relate to you as a leader. I can relate to this story. So there's all this stuff about vulnerability that we hear about, and about transparency. These things are actually really important to get your listener to identify with you as a storyteller. And if you're putting too much space between you and the listener, that story is going to fall flat. Second thing to look at is sort of meeting people where they're at. I think this is so important, that your starting point, when you think about the hero's journey, which we can talk more about, it starts off in this ordinary world where things are just kind of like very everyday, and jumps off into this magical world. If you're not starting your story talking about things that people experience and care about right now, then they're glazing over. It used to be that there was one channel or there was one radio station and you had no choice but to sit there and listen to some voice of God telling you what to think. Now people will tune out if you're not meeting their needs and their questions right from the start. I'll say one more thing, I think, which is a story is not a story unless it contains a few key elements. Characters, so tangible people or animals or anything that's actually alive that someone can relate to. Conflict. It has to actually have some values at play in it where people are trying to do different things. And then it has to be something where people don't understand or know what the end is going to be. Too many leadership stories and marketing stories are just like they start here and they just go like this. Just you know where it's going. It's going to get better and better and better, and more promises are going to be made. Where stories that captivate and capture people, they go like this, and they have unpredictable twists and turns. So many marketers struggle to put anything twisty or turny in their marketing that from the minute you sit down where the story is going. It's not a story that's going to grab. So those are just some of the pitfalls. In the book, I talk about tons of them. And I don't think it's as hard as we think to overcome them when you start making that switch, especially to thinking about your audience as the hero instead of yourself as the hero.
Excellent. So we got to be catching ourselves as organizational leaders. Like if we're talking too much about ourselves and our vision and so on, if we're too detached from what our audience actually cares about here and now, and if the story is too predictable, like this linear, everything's going to be great, as opposed to the roller coaster, 3 common mistakes. I'm certainly making quite a few of those on an ongoing basis. So thank you, Jonah, for holding up that mirror to all of us. I'm sure many resonated with those pitfalls. Now I'd love to switch gears and go into the framework or the formula, at least the pieces of it that you found based on your analysis, putting together this book, but also your experience since then. So if you had to narrow it down to the fewest number of critical ingredients of what leads to successful storytelling, what would you say are those main ingredients? First, as just a bird's eye view, like just what are they? And then we'll take them in turn to go a bit deeper, to explore how can we do better in each and every one of those in our lives, in our organizations, and for our world.
Yeah. So I found these 3 commandments from this 19th century marketer named John Powers, who he was like the first to write about advertising. And he had these 3 commandments, and they were be interesting, tell the truth, and then essentially paraphrased, live the truth, which means that if you want to be successful as a storyteller, first, do some of the stuff that I was talking about. Find that unique voice, surprise people, delight people, engage people, tap into that creativity as opposed to just droning on your facts, figures, and ideas. 2, tell the truth. Don't try to be somebody that you're not. Don't tell stories that can't be backed up. Don't tell stories that are simply about what you hope you could be, but find in that deep space of what you bring, whether it's a product or as a leader or as a parent, get authentic. And then 3rd, live the truth. This is so important that we live in this kind of ultra transparent society of very low trust. And your audiences are always going to be looking for that hypocrisy. And I write a lot in the book about the trap of hypocrisy. You want to tell stories that actually pull you toward where you want to go. And that once you tell that story, you have to live up to it. The best storytellers are constantly telling themselves the story of where they should go, and then holding themselves to it, asking their employees and followers to hold them to it as well. So those are 3 really simple ones. On a little bit more zoomed down level, I think the most important insight I can give is to really define what a story is, and then to talk about how you can leverage it in your personal or organizational brand. So, okay, everybody talks about stories. Everybody says we need to tell better stories. How do you actually think about a story? Here's how I think about it. You've got 3 layers. On the top of a story, you've got your characters, your conflict, your settings, all the stuff that is totally visible, that everybody can see. Now, those things are not set up there by happenstance. The storyteller doesn't just randomly talk about people and things and just like blab on, because you wouldn't listen. You would know it's not a story. Everyone is placed there for a very specific reason. And that reason is to illustrate a core truth that the storyteller believes. or wants you to believe. Maybe they don't believe it themselves, but they want you to believe it. That's called the moral of the story, right? And in the old days, the story would just tell you at the end, this is the moral, but we don't do that anymore. But you want to organize every action to illustrate that truth about the world. That's how we create these reality simulators that people love to tune into. That moral itself hides something even deeper, which are the values that we want to transmit. So if I tell you a story and the moral is better safe than sorry, you know that I'm trying to get you to value safety and security. If I tell you a story and the moral is he who hesitates is lost, you know that I want you to value risk and adventure, etc. So, okay, that's still a bit academic. What do we do with that? What I encourage people I work with to do is make sure that everything that you say and do on behalf of your leadership brand or your organization is like those characters on the surface, is meant to illustrate a core truth about the world that matters to your audience. And the best brands basically just stand for a truth. And they can do it for years. Like Nike came out with the whole thing that Nike did in the 90s was saying it takes tremendous hard work to succeed. And all these other brands were like, oh, we'll make it easy for you, convenient, simple, fun. And they're like, no, you have to sweat and you have to do it, and it's your journey. And they've been doing that for like the last 30 years. And they've even used that as like, how do we live up to our own excellence in their sustainability, et cetera. So if you know that core truth you stand for, and you know those values that you want to purport in the world, what you can do is build this beautiful brand where on the surface, every tweet, every Facebook post, everything that you do is an expression of that core truth that you believe in and you want your audience to believe in. And then you know what those core values are, and then you show how you're living those values day to day. And I really use Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I know it's old, but I think it's very powerful to say that the brands and the people who get the best storytelling results are those who are calling to people's higher values. So when you call on people to worry about their safety and security, you call on people to worry about making enough money to get by, you make them feel insecure, they don't fit in. You're not capturing what at the top of Maslow's hierarchy. Appeal to people's creativity, appeal to people's community sense, appeals to people's desire to be a courageous hero in their own lives. And that gets that kind of uplift that all the best brands kind of use in this new social media era.
Amazing. Thank you, Jonah. So just replaying that and like trying to get to some action items in my own head. So what you're saying is critical to identify a core truth, and everything you do is basically a testament to that truth. And what you're demonstrating out there is the values associated with that truth, that you're living them and you're showing them on an ongoing basis.
Exactly.
So how do we take this? So that's an exercise we can all do. And I'm going to ask you how we can what's a good thing we can do with our teams or on our own. With the holidays coming up and all the spare time we're going to have, I say that jokingly, but like we'll have hopefully a bit more spare time. How do we bring those? But how do we also marry it with like, there's so many companies out there that, say positive sounding things, but it falls flat. It's not authentic, or it doesn't go viral. Like nobody cares. They have this whole campaign and nobody shares anything. How do we marry like the first part of what you said, be interesting, tell the truth, live the truth, with this like core truth and values? What else is like the magic ingredient? What really makes it take off in your view?
I feel that those things are always changing. Especially because like the algorithms of social media, as I was mentioning earlier, I've been very involved in the movie The Social Dilemma. What gets to our attention is very different than it used to be in the old days, where it's just like if someone liked your thing, they would pass it on to their friends. I think what we have to do now is we have to even be more attuned to what is the news and the mood of the moment, and how is our core timeless truth that we stand for and our core journey engaged in, and how do we take risks to step into those moments. So I think it's very hard to actually break through unless you've nailed the humor thing and you just make the funniest post for the day, which is still a total crapshoot. I think you need to really attune yourself to the controversies and moments of the time. And I don't think necessarily that brands should always be weighing in, but after I wrote this book, after a couple of years of teaching this stuff, I really started encouraging brands to take social stands and to step up into that kind of gap where to be one of the first to respond to a cultural moment, to respond to a cause moment, and do something brave that not everyone is going to love, but that your core supporters are going to think is amazing. And it's that whole thing: if you appeal to everybody, you don't appeal to anyone. And so figure out where your values and those core customers you're trying to reach, or core followers you're trying to reach, are, and take some controversial stands to show that you're part of their tribe. I think that's how, if you want that viral pickup, what we have to do these days. I still really regret. I sit on a number of nonprofit boards, and we're trying to, mostly not environmental, and we're spending all of our money on Facebook advertising, which is terrible because we're also trying to fight what Facebook is doing to society. So I really regret in some ways that we all have to use these platforms. And one of the big breakthroughs on one of the climate change boards that I'm on is they started using TikTok influencers, paying young people to share a message about climate change. And I find now we're not paying the social media groups. We're paying young people who are sharing their values. So now we have these new opportunities, I think, to be influential with influencers, and to break through just the advertising model, to really building that tribe, to see how we get our tribe to make content for us, is a next important step. And that's becoming easier and easier through these marketplaces as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I guess what I'm taking from that is, like, it's so critical to be dynamic and proactive. It's not just about coming up with some static story for your brand and hoping that goes viral. It's got to be tapping into the zeitgeist wherever possible,
Yeah.
obviously within reason.
I mean,
So, got
you could think of your brand. I think it's worth thinking of your entire brand as an epic story. Just the whole brand is a story. And each thing that you do is another chapter or another mini chapter of that story. You've got to constantly be refreshing it, making it relevant to the moment. But you want to have that through line, that the brand itself is the core story that you're trying to tell, and everything is just an expression of that story. That's where you get the most pickup, I think.
That's pretty profound, because it's very easy to fall into the trap of thinking, what's the story we should be telling, as opposed to, like, what is the story is the brand. Like, that is what it is we're living through, and everything we do is these chapters. So powerful, Jonah. Thank you. Could you share with us, like, let's say you were going to work with a company, right? Big or small, doesn't matter what industry, but, like, what would you say are, like, the most critical steps a company could take, or what are the key questions they could answer, whether it's as an executive team or all hands, to help them get more aligned with all of these suggestions that you're making? So how do you, like, take all of this? Let's say we have a lot of, like, top leaders of organizations listening to this, right? So it's easy for them to get excited and be like, yeah, I want to get this done. But then, of course, just because they want it doesn't mean, like, the whole company and its customer base goes in the same direction. So what have you found to be, like, the critical steps that a company can make to really crystallize their core truth, their values, and have that process of engaging with what's going on? Like, how do you routinize it so that it doesn't become just, like, on the whims of the leader, but rather something that the organization does all the time?
Yeah. One of the worst experiences of my life was teaching a storytelling class at a big social media company. And I had a bunch of executives in the room. And one of the things I wanted to do was I wanted to teach them sort of this formula. So I said, okay, I want you to write down something that you really deeply believe. So they all could do that. And then I said, I want you to think about an experience that taught you that this was true. I figured this would be, like, the easy, and this is an all-day workshop. I figured this would be the easiest step. They all, except for one guy, they all raised their hand, like, I don't know what you're talking about. I can't think of a story that illustrates this. And I'm like, well, if you believe it, you must have experienced it. And yet there's this giant gap between what we think we believe and, like, what's actually happening in our lives, or where we draw these beliefs from. So that was, like, the biggest bomb workshop I ever I couldn't get out of it. I just, like, wasted the whole day after that. So when I think about this, it is really important. If you go, it's not so easy to just say, as a company, what do we stand for? Why are we doing this? Now, I'm not the only person at all who is going to recommend that you have a purpose to your business. There's a million practical ways to figure out what your purpose is, or to engage your business with a purpose. But think about, from your founding stories, the reason that you came into being, to your moments of greatest risk and despair, to your greatest triumphs. What is it that you've been pursuing this whole time? It's not just profit and money that you think that you stand for. And the leaders can give you a lot of that. But then also asking your most ardent customers or your most ardent followers? Why are you in this journey with us? What do you think we stand for? So then when you start to figure out, I just say, like, talk to your employees, talk to your customers, look at your founding stories, figure out what is your moral of the story. And like I said, from that workshop, it's not always easy. Like, what really, then if you say, what are the stories that illustrate how we've pursued that moral or we've lived that moral, you can start generating these are really important for leaders to talk about. Like at your next retreat, if you theme your story to your audience around why this pursuit has been an ongoing pursuit for you and the company, it's so powerful. Then you can start to say, okay, well, if that's what we believe, what are those values that we're trying to share with the world? What values is that based on? And then saying, where are those values? Where are the gaps? Where are we not living those values, or where are we not actually pursuing that? What if we pursued it 1,000%? What if we pursued it 10,000%? What if we threw profit out the window and just made this an organization just to pursue that one truth about the world? Now, I'm not saying that you do that. I'm saying you push yourself. This is the best instantiation of your company, is when you are living for a core human truth. But before you go crazy and just start pursuing it, I would make sure that that core truth is not, if you say your core truth is like, we make the best pillows in the business, that is not a core human truth. A core human truth is, about the power of creativity. Like when Apple came out, of course, and just said, no, a computer is not a tool for counting numbers. A computer is a tool for human creativity. All that advertising sort of just came from that one idea. What is your one idea that just like, that blows the roof off of your purpose and why you're here? And then finding those places where you're failing to meet your mission is so important, because that's where you can actually turn your business around away from those weak spots. Because I guarantee that your employees are talking about your moments of hypocrisy and those places where your soaring mission is just not being met. So these are really powerful things. They don't get you right to that viral story, but it's the first step in making a brand that's coherent and story-based.
Yeah, this is such a powerful exercise, I think, for all of us to undertake if we haven't done it recently. And then share with us again, like, so let's say we do these exercises, we engage our team, we engage our customers, everyone is amped. Yep, that's absolutely the core truth. Those values resonate so well, everyone is on board, right? And then, of course, you have your P&L and you're doing the stuff, and then you want to keep telling the better story. What have you seen to be the most effective way? Like, is it just the marketing department that should then figure out, like, okay, well, how do we tell those stories? Or how do you engage on a recurring basis? Like, how do you make sure that that was an awesome offsite like 2.5 years ago when we did that, but now, other than some posters, like, we've got nothing left? How do you really bake it into the DNA? So what are the recurring meetings or recurring activities you would recommend the team to do at different levels, so that this isn't some story that was created a while ago, but it's a living, breathing one that's constantly evolving?
Yeah. So I think internal and teaching internal storytelling. I think you're not asking so much about marketing at the moment, but about keeping the story alive within the organization. That story, first of all, you need your core organizational stories that get told and retold. So you want to align everything that you've done up to this point. How is our founding story? How are our key moments all reflection of this larger epic? And you can work with a contractor storyteller to do that. You can figure it out yourself. You want to align all those true things that happen with this larger idea. Then what you want to, and make sure that part of the onboarding process, part of the corporate memory, is these stories. But then you want to really start to theme around in meetings. You can start to theme, please surface the stories of how are we living out these values, and ask people specifically to say, like, all right, what's our courage? Let's say your value is courage. What's our courage moment this week? And start celebrating and rewarding people for embodying that value. Or where are we failing to be courageous? Bringing those values back up again, and leaders saying, look, we stand for the courageous life. Let's just say that's what we stand for. We believe the courageous life is a better life. Where are we falling short? And let people come out. I wrote another book called Unsafe Thinking, this book, more recently, and it's about, I talk a lot about intelligent disobedience. You want an organization in which people feel free to speak up to leaders and say, no, we're falling short of our story right now. We got to honor the story. So I would say it becomes an easy thing to do, actually, when you reward people, specifically call them out, give them social credit for living the values, and letting them reflect back to you where the values are falling short. can be extremely powerful and probably much more impactful than a great viral video on the long-term success of a corporation.
Yeah, so I guess like the recurring theme here is constantly celebrating when you live accordance to the values and when you're creating the additions to the story of like how you're living the core truth, but also constantly asking that question of where are we failing? I mean, and so much of what you said today, it keeps going back to those, like, where are we doing it right? Where are we not doing it
Yeah.
right? And it gives that critical thinking.
Yeah. I mean, what an organization rewards and talks about says so much more than any report or brand guide or book. And so, when leaders are maniacally focused on, sharing things about efficiency, profit, compliance with a set of rules, you can talk about everything else that you want. But if the leader is like focused on compliance and efficiency, that that's what's being rewarded. When a leader is, making sacrifices across the whole company operation to live a deeper value, and when people are being, rewarded publicly and stories are being, and one of the best rewards, by the way, is a story that reflects someone. When a leader tells a story about an individual, and shares that story as an archetypal story of the organization, that is better than bonuses a lot of the time, because it's this public recognition that this person is a reflection of the company's best self. And that's what tells people that the story is real, not like, oh, this consultant said it, we put it on our wall, there's a poster. So yeah.
Okay, amazing. So I think what I'm thinking about, what I encourage everybody to think about is, of the 100% of your time that you do have at work, running meetings, doing your things internally, like, how much are you talking about and rewarding the things that is the core truth, that are the core values? What's that percentage right now, and what do you think it should be? I think, definitely for me, I'm seeing a gap there. Like, there's a room to improve. And thank you, Jonah, for giving us many of those tools. Now, taking it from the internal storytelling and having it be authentic, let's now move to the external world. In terms of cadence, in terms of like how to think about like how do we put out there our messaging, and also what platforms to use and so on. You mentioned about like, well, if you want people seeing it on Facebook, you better be putting some dollars behind it, because that's how things are picking up. Just share with us how that goes. Like, do you think a brand, let's say if a brand is quiet for more than a month, is that like, are they just going stagnant? Do you think it should be like as, let's say, active as like every month trying to say something about what's going on or say something new? Just cadence wise, what do you think is a best practice? And then in terms of platforms, like, what have you seen have been working? I don't mean just like what's the latest platform today that's most powerful. I just mean more about like the intersection between like books and radio and old school stuff to the, like, the new social media that's out there.
Yeah. So I think these questions are difficult because like B2B and B2C, and they're very different. I think that and there are certain companies that just they can benefit from paid social media because they've just figured out their acquisition costs. They've done the A/B testing. They understand like what exactly they can make a little bit more money than they spend with every acquisition. But so it really does depend in a lot of ways. But I would say that what you need to do is really go on the journey with your customer. How are your customer interacting with you? How are they finding you? And a lot of times, just having that right YouTube video with 10,000, a review of your product with 10,000 views can be an enormous thing if people are finding you in a very niche way and they stumble on this great video that one of your customers made, and you might want to put money behind that rather than the thing that you just made yourself. But if you're going to do that, you have to also see like, well, how does this align with that core story? Is this just are we getting a lot of kind of action on this thing because it's weird, or is it really aligned with our story? So figuring out how to seed content across channels in which people can find you, recognizing that like views, I mean like social media reach, when someone's like, well, we had 1 billion social media impressions, that's like the least interesting thing you can possibly say, because most people are scrolling through and not looking. But if you're in those places where people are looking for your thing and your thing is there in the most unique and fresh way, that's where you're going to gain customers. So I just think it's a matter of having that marketing savvy to understand what your brand is about, understand what you stand for, and then figure out how to meet those customers where they are with content that delights and surprises them. And that is changing all the time. Like I said, I was very pleased to see that you can, instead of giving your money to Facebook, you can pay, a 17-year-old kid $100 to talk about their passion for climate change. And that's going right into the pocket of a kid who could actually use the money and who's getting an authentic story. I think things like that are fantastic, especially when you're doing something that's authentic, right? You're not just paying people to lie about your product.
Excellent. Thank you, Jonah. I've got two final tactical quick questions, and then we have amazing audience questions. So we're going to switch gears. Tactical question. Okay. So you have your core value, you have your core truths, you've got your values, you're super excited to reach out. Let's say it's an individual email you're sending or a campaign that you're going to do to the whole world. There's this like constant battle between like, you really want to tell the story, but people have absolutely no time, right? They're being flooded with information. Share with us what your approach has been to that. Like, how do you break through the, like the neurological, psychological defense mechanisms that everybody has, which is like, everyone's trying to sell me something. So I gotta, like ignore basically vast majority of the messages I'm receiving every day. How do you like maintain that, like the need to be super concise and very to the point, like especially in business writing or business messaging, with this soulful, truthful, value-filled storytelling that we'd all love to do if we could write a book and like have everybody read it. So share with us like how you balance those forces.
Yeah, that famous Mark Twain quote, which is like, I wanted to write you a short letter, but I didn't have time, so I wrote you a long one. I think that desire to just get it all out there and say everything is, it's both like a lack of time and it's somewhat narcissistic. It's just like, well, this is it matters to me, so it's going to matter to you. And you're like, you have to start your communications embodying your customer, being your customer, and thinking what is the least number of words and images that I can use to open this doorway to a relationship. And I use this model that I call freaks, cheats, and familiars to tap into people's kind of basic evolutionary impulses to get their attention. So the idea of freaks is like, be unexpected, right? So the great stories have these dragons or these elephant-headed gods or things that just like, whoa, I've never seen this before, I have to look. What are you doing in your communication that no one's ever seen before or is not expected? So I often write things and I'll throw away the first 3 drafts just on principle. I'll be like, no, what's the weirdest thing I can say? What's the craziest thing I can say? What image can I give that's going to make people say, what the hell is that? So that you are going to like tune in. That's just how our brains work. If you see a thumbnail that doesn't actually computer make sense, you're going to look at it. If you see yet another like multicultural happy family, picking up their kid, you don't even see it. So how do you break people's attention and like put off that alarm bell that something important is happening right here, by shocking them essentially, but not shocking them with like violence or, then the idea of cheats is we tune into stories where people break the rules and are either rewarded or punished for it. So we love hearing about setting up a situation in which someone has done something that kind of breaks the norms of society, that isn't different, the rebel or the outlaw. And so when you think about what kind of question are you setting up? What tension are you setting up in the story? Start with a question, start with something where people don't know where this is going. And you're going to be like, oh, I have to learn more. I had to find out what this is. And then familiars is just about really starting where people are at. So I mentioned this before, don't write an email if that's what you're thinking of, if that's the case study here. Don't write an email that starts with what you want them to do. Write an email about what they're thinking about, what you think they might be thinking about right now. Tie it into something, a conversation that they're having. And I learned that by making, when we did the factory farming video about the spoof of The Matrix, it was like nobody wanted to look at a picture of tortured chickens or cows being abused on factory farms. If I sent you that and said, here, look what's happening to cows on factory farms, you would not open that email. But if you're like, what is the Matrix? You would be like, oh, what does this mean? And I'd be tapping right at that point. We put it out. The Matrix was the #1 movie in the country. So people were thinking about it. And then they're like, oh, you're delighting me and surprising me. Now here's a cow in a trench coat. What the hell is this? There's a freak, right? And then these rebels who are fighting against the factory farming machine. At that moment, that was the viral breakthrough. It doesn't work again. But thinking along those lines is super powerful.
Excellent. And Jonah, that was very well put. When you look at like the decade or so since you wrote the book, and then the current times we're living in, and you think obviously in your role today a lot about the future and when things are going. Share with us your thoughts on where storytelling is going. Like, what are the most critical trends we should keep in mind to kind of like take everything you shared with us and essentially augment it through the lens of like where you think the world is going and what aspects of this is going to get further emphasized or de-emphasized accordingly.
Yeah, I mean, wow, so much has happened and so much has changed. And I think you're asking me questions on like both the global political as well as the marketing and individual. So let me try to answer some of the things that I've seen that change, but this conversation can go on all day probably. I really am. So I started writing in 2008 actually. And this is when Obama came out with Yes, We Can. And there was this sense of like, this is the first presidential campaign where the president is not saying, I'm going to fix the country for you. It's like, we're going to fix the country together. And I saw that as really this big change from brand or leader as hero to audience as hero. And and it was huge on social media at the time, whatever social media existed at the time. Now we saw a total swing back with Trump, which is, only I can fix it, Trump as hero. And this kind of a return to broadcast. And I'm still trying to make sense of it in a lot of ways about like, are these swings just sort of a natural in the political sphere, for instance, the swing from empowerment of the country towards empowerment of the individual. I think what Trump really did well, even though I think he was counter to that trend, which I still think is ascendant for most marketing, is he really met people where they were at. He tapped into this kind of anger and disaffection that he understood better than those who were sitting above it all and didn't take the time to actually dive in and understand what was being said on social media, understand what those conversations were happening in living rooms across the country. And so what I would say is that we more than ever need to be able to understand the zeitgeist, be able to understand where people's pain points are, where people are living and where they're at. And when you do, almost any sort of storytelling can reach them. So in some ways, that familiars thing about reaching people where they stand at the moment is more important than ever. I do think that we haven't seen that with brands, though. We haven't seen brands go back to the old way of saying, you suck, if you don't buy our product, you're going to be unhappy, which was the old broadcast tool. We still see brands going further and further in this direction of, you can be a hero, we can help, which again, was sort of started in the 90s. With Nike and Apple and the most admired brands out there still as storytellers. I think the other thing that we've seen is I had this very positive, hopeful view that by breaking the stranglehold of corporate America or the corporations on the media landscape, we were going to get this democratic, open, positive storytelling environment. I think, as if you've seen The Social Dilemma, as you can see, that's really not gone the way we had hoped. Where now, in some ways, social media is leading to more polarization and misinformation and tribalism than the old media empires did. So I think that this is urgent that this gets solved, and that if we want a good storytelling environment, we need good actors upon platforms upon which we tell those stories, and that has not emerged yet. So part of my work now is to try to spur those new platforms to exist.
Excellent, Jonah. Thank you so much. This has been fantastic. Going to dive straight into the audience Q&A. We have quite a few, so we'll do like quick fire questions and answers. First one from Scott Alter. You already started answering this, so taking all his political views out of it, can you talk about why Donald Trump is such a good storyteller and how he's able to engage a huge population? So you already mentioned meeting people where they're at. Was there anything else any other tactics or strategies that he employed that you think really resonated with people?
Yeah, and we can definitely spend the rest of this conversation talking about this. So I'll just say one more thing about it. When you read into the whole Steve Bannon playbook and what Steve Bannon is really about, and I think he was the impetus for Trump in his early days of campaigning, beginning of his administration. Bannon really sees this fight between Western civilization and the forces of darkness that are trying to bring Western civilization down, illiberalism, and wants to create a reascendancy of the West. And obviously most voters do not know this or think about it or care about it, but he is talking in these epic mythical terms. And Trump was able to tap into that, into this sense that these values, so Make America Great Again is itself a mythical type of appeal that's trying to create a story about what America was and what the West was, and then these hordes who are trying to basically come in and destroy these valuable assets that we have and this valuable culture that we have. He understood it as a culture war from the beginning. We talk about the story wars; those are culture wars, essentially. Which stories are going to win, and Trump understood that from the very beginning. And so I do think that this tapping into the giant historical trends and the giant identity trends of the West versus anarchy has been really powerful for him, and he was able to translate it to something that everybody can understand and that people sensed but didn't know how to. It's more what Bannon's working on is more academic, but I think that was what was good work for him. And when people said, well, what do you mean, when was America great? He didn't even have to answer that question because it was a mythical call. Ultimately, it took a long time, I think, for reality to catch up with him, and ultimately it did.
Thank you so much, Jonah, and thank you, Scott, for that great question. Next one is from Alexander Konetsky. He asks, in terms of developing a story, what questions would you recommend that a solo entrepreneur asks regarding a venture that's just starting out?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways it's easier when you're just starting out and you can sort of like lay the foundations of your story rather than trying to like excavate it from years of maybe random behavior that the company has gone through. So I would just go back to what I said before is, ask yourself, why are you starting out on this journey? What do you stand for? What are you trying to bring into being in the world? What's the purpose of the organization? What values is that based on? And then how do you project everything that you do as a living of those values? And then just see if those are resonant with the kind of people that you want to reach. Ask them what they are trying to live, and figure out. We didn't talk about the hero's journey here at all, and maybe we should. The hero's journey is really about an ordinary person meeting a mentor. Obi-Wan Kenobi, Morpheus, the fairy godmother, God in the story of Moses in the Bible, who tells them you have a great destiny, you can do something amazing, and I'm going to show you how. And I think you want to think about your brand as that mentor to your developing hero, who's your audience. And so, what's your mentor's voice? The best brands don't speak in the voice of God; they speak in the voice of a real human being who someone wants to have a relationship with. The hero's journey story is always about a very personal relationship between the hero and the mentor. So think of your brand as a mentor, calling your hero to live their highest values. Figure out what is that archetype that you want to use. I use archetypes a lot. Like if we were a person, what kind of person would we be? Figure that out, and then set out on that journey to bring those values into the world in partnership with your audiences. I do recommend reading the book probably if you want to do the whole journey, but that's some of the insights I share.
Amazing, Jonah. I never thought of that, as your business is like the Yoda or the Obi-Wan to the audience. Very, very nice. Thank you. We've got a question from Annalise Crawford. She asks, what advice would you give to a young person who's interested in storytelling as a career? Any colleges or majors that are helpful? What are the jobs that need storytelling skills?
Yeah, so I think there's the best storytellers that I know come out of a couple of different backgrounds. I think there's still, it's hard to justify going to journalism school for a lot of reasons these days, cost-wise, and on the other side. But I've noticed just how many journalists, people who know how to actually excavate a story from a random set of facts or a random set of events, have a huge amount of value to organizations and companies that are trying to tell stories. So I actually think that journalism school is a great starting point for storytelling. I also think cultural, so I did two things in college. I was the editor of the college newspaper, and I studied American studies. And the kind of classes that I took that gave me these sort of insights were classes like we watched war films from World War II to Vietnam, and we picked apart what was it saying about American culture at the time. What did Rambo say about Iran-Contra, for instance? So how do these stories help us to form our identity as a nation? So I think that studying cultural studies, and I think that journalism school is very powerful and probably better than getting going into communications and marketing, which I think is still sort of caught up in my opinion in the in the tactics and or in just the kind of MBA business management. But not always. Of course, there's gems of professors everywhere. But
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jonah. Next one from Kave Vafai. The question is, are there some common themes and stories to get a point across? So sacrifice, good versus evil. What are the greatest ones of these that we should keep in mind that really get people to dive into it? You already mentioned that, like, hero's journey of the rise and fall and so on. Share with us what other key themes really strike a nerve with people.
Yeah, there are lots of great. If you study the hero's journey, it has many phases within it. It's meant to be a sort of catch-all for like all great stories across time. It doesn't totally succeed, but you can even pull out the elements of those of the hero's journey and find like 5 or 6 really good templates. So one great template, like I mentioned, is the story of someone who breaks expectations, breaks cultural norms, and is either punished or rewarded for it. So the outlaw or the rebel story is a huge one. It comes across all the time. A second one is the story of, and so few people tell this, like as I mentioned at the beginning, because they want everything to be rosy all the time, but stories of failure that lead to unexpected success. So, start out in the belly of the beast, as they say in the hero's journey. My name Jonah actually, gets you. That's where that comes from being swallowed by the whale. So just that start a story in your lowest moment and show how unlikely it was to be able to get out of it, and then talk about all the people who supported you along the way and all the helpers that you got to get from that point of like no return and failure into ultimate success. I think finally, like stories of people who were on the wrong track and who were deluded or going over to the dark side, who learned a lesson and came over to the light. So the story of sort of like how Darth Vader, redemption stories essentially, how Darth Vader is finally redeemed in Star Wars. People can't get enough of redemption stories essentially. So yeah, I think there's tons of formulas to look for. And my early career in spoofing just taught me, like, take a story that you love, break it down into its component parts, and then you can rebuild a story around that same structure. When George Lucas was trying to write Star Wars and was stuck trying to do it in the 70s, he just called Joseph Campbell. Was like, how do you do this? And Joseph Campbell was like, oh, I'll teach it to you. And he taught him the hero's journey, and he just built it right off that framework.
Amazing. Thank you, Jonah. So next question is from Leticia Palacios Santos. The question is in Spanish, so I pasted it into Google Translate, and this is how it came out in English. How can we be objective in our evaluations on the subject without our personal perception skewing the results? Because the results can be not accurate. So what has served you in keeping yourself objective and not letting your subjective reality shape things in a negative manner?
Yeah, I mean, well, and another trite quotation used to be in the in the 60s, they would say, half of all advertising dollars are wasted, we just don't know which half. And that's sort of no longer the case, right? You can deploy stories and deploy experiments and do a ton of A/B testing, see what gets response, see what doesn't get response. It doesn't cost anything to put out a tweet. I think that you need to have enough capacity and time to experiment with the stories and listen to what the responses are. So if you have a story that you really want to tell and can't find an audience for, it's just time to tell a new story. Like there's not or to really go out and figure out what the audience is. A story that you tell yourself is really not very valuable. A story becomes alive when it starts to reach other listeners and to create that empathy between you. So yeah, I mean, in the old days when I used to make viral videos, I used to fail quite a bit because it would take us like 3 months to put one together. And then if it didn't work, that was it. It didn't work. Now you really can be in flow and experiment, but you can't think of it as in like, well, we'll have one story a quarter. You have to be in this constant process of unfolding your story, which is where that insight of your brand is a story, that's the story, is valuable, because then you're like, everything that we do is just an experiment and a new chapter. Some chapters will suck, some will be great, and you'll learn as you go.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jonah. I'm going to combine the remaining two questions that we have into one. So Fernando Jaramillo asks, any advice on do's and don'ts in telling business stories in a podcast? So hold that thought. David Hampson asks, do you have exercises on how to tell stories on different platforms, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and so on, Twitter? especially it's all different media character restrictions. A video may be good for some who learn through watching, but someone who reads etc may need something else. So zooming out here, I guess what I would say is, how do you start? Do you start with like what the story should be and then adapt it to different platforms? Or does it help sometimes, like when you were coming up with these viral stories where you had a platform in mind and you were working backwards? And anything on podcasting specifically, so we also satisfy Fernando's question as well.
Yeah. It's a story and a podcast. Well, I think generally the rise of the podcast is a fascinating, unexpected. I came up with attention spans getting shorter and shorter and shorter, and more like, well, how do you tell a 3-minute story? How do you tell a 1-minute story? How do you tell a 5-second story? And podcasts obviously are ways that we can engage people over hundreds of hours sometimes. I would say if I was going to think about the building of a podcast, I would follow a lot of the same rules about like, how do you not set up a conversation or an arc of conversations to be predictable and expectable? How do you break someone's expectations of what they're going to hear? How do you bring them in with a bit of a mystery? What's this really going to be about? And how do you leave them with that core single truth that they're going to walk away with? When I worked in the newspaper in college, it was always like, my mentor would call it the "Hey Martha" moment. It's like when you're reading the newspaper, what's the thing you're going to turn to your wife and say, "Hey Martha, you won't believe this." And I think a lot of, when we have longer form conversations, we forget that we still need to have those insights that have to be shared, and that someone's going to say, you have to listen to this episode because X. So when I'm editing something like a podcast, I'm thinking, how do I build it around that core gem that I know is going to make it shareable? And then if you're in, the question might be a little too broad for me to answer about like, how do you build for every platform? But I would say, your brand story doesn't necessarily change based on platform, but you need to be building things native for that platform, because there's, just so many attempts to just throw things out there that don't fit that community, and they're worthless. So, yeah.
All right. Awesome, Jonah. This has been fantastic. Last question for you. You were so generous with your time and insights. This was really powerful. How can we, across our community, best support you, your endeavors? What's most top of mind for you? What's most important to you? And we're going to do our very best to support you with that. And if you have a final word of wisdom or call to action for us, we'd love to hear that as well. And we'll wrap up.
Okay, great. Yeah, well, I've stopped doing consulting and running a marketing company. I now run a nonprofit social venture with my co-founder Justin Rosenstein, who's the founder of Asana and inventor of the like button and Google Drive. And we are spending our time trying to think about what comes next after capitalism and how to do better forms of economic exchange and deep forms of democracy. So we're trying to write a whole new story for civilization, essentially. And we are looking, we're growing quickly. We're building a think tank. We're looking for advisors. We're looking for co-funders. Justin just put $500 million into this effort. So we're looking to scale, but we really need to scale at the speed of wisdom and not at the kind of typical Silicon Valley way. So we can use input and thoughts along these lines. Like I said, we were heavily involved with the social dilemma, and we're trying to help solve some of these issues about and you probably saw Justin in the social dilemma if you saw it. So we're trying to solve some of these issues about like societal level breakdown and how we leap to the next level through the eco crisis, through the social crises that we face, and how to reinvigorate democracy. So I'm sure that's big enough for everybody to see themselves in some degree, but would love to hear from you guys, and would love support along the way. And you can go to oneproject.org, and you can find me at jonassachs.com.
Amazing.
Oh, and we just put out a new book called The New Possible. It's about visions of the future and what might come true. And some folks like Tristan Harris, Michael Pollan contributed to that. So it's a series of essays about what might come after COVID. So if you want to read more, you can read one of my books or read that book.
Amazing. Well, all the best to you rewriting the story of civilization. I think it's actually an incredible endeavor. And I know that so many of us would love to be involved in some way. Today, you gave us some super powerful tools, very practical, very actionable. So really excited to have time actually over the holidays to reflect on not just the story of my organization and for all of us the organizational stuff, but also a lot of this applies to us personally as well. What's the story we're telling? What's the core truth we live for? How do we better realign with that? So I can't imagine a better kind of conversation to help us wrap up the year with. So thank you, Jonah, for everything, and hope to see you again very soon.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you. And thanks everybody for listening.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, everyone. See you all again soon. Jonah, take care. Until next time, be well, everyone.